Hello and welcome to another episode of the Low Budget Review Show. I am your host, Eric Smith. I still have no theme music, so I'll just get on with it. Uh, Today I want to talk about a book by the wonderful James A. Moore titled Seven Forges. There we go. And Seven Forges is a fantasy from Angry Robot Books. First in, I don't know if it's going to be a series. I know there's at least one more book coming out. James A. Moore. The first James A. Moore read was some media tie-in stuff, and I didn't know who he was. But he wrote some books for White Wolf Publishing, which I read because I was reading the White Wolf Publishing books. And I believe he wrote at least one Buffy the Vampire Slayer novel, I believe. I think he did the novelization of the video game, but don't hold me to that. And then I started, so I was reading that stuff. Didn't really register who this James A. Moore guy was. But then I found some of his other stuff, his horror, um, things like Serenity Falls, Under the Overtree, and such, and really became a fan. He's got a great character named Jonathan Crowley. Love that character. He's in a bunch of books. Man, they could make a movie or a TV show or anything with that character. I would love to see it. I would read it. I would watch it. But James A. Moore has now decided to write some fantasy. And it's pretty good fantasy. It's, as I said, the first, so there's a lot of world building, which you have to do, with things like horror, generally, it takes place in our world, or something very close to our world. So we all know that world. So aside from science fiction, which still can take place in our world, or at least springboard off of our world, with fantasy, typically it all has to be created from scratch. Yes, there are some that, again, springboard from our world, or I suppose take place in our world, but generally, you know, Lord of the Rings doesn't take place on Earth. It's Middle Earth. Anyway, so Seven Forges builds a new world, and the main character, I'm going to have to read this. Fantasy names are going to be the death of me trying to pronounce these things. Hopefully, I'm pretty close here. This one's relatively simple. The main character is Meros Dulver, and he is from Feline? Feline? See, I don't know. Anyway, the book starts with him on a trek through the Blasted Lands to the Seven Forges. He's on a mission. He's been hired by a sorcerer, basically, who wants him to map out this area that the people have not been to in centuries? A long, long time. And on the way there, he meets some people, if I could use that word, meets some folks that they didn't know existed. And so it becomes this meeting of two different groups and learning different cultures. And apparently there was a prophecy of some sort that Dulver was going to show up here at the Seven Forges. So they bring him in, and then they're going to go back to the capital of Feline, or Feline, or Feline, or however you say it. And, pardon me. So that they can meet the king of the kingdom that Dulver comes from, and there's going to be all this. But there's clashes, and there's creatures, and there's fights, and there's swords, and there's blood, and there's it's a culture clash, and intrigue, and a bit of a cliffhanger. This is, like I said, there's definitely a second book. I don't know how many more, but this book definitely has a cliffhanger, which means I'm just champing at the bit to find out what's going to happen, because, yeah, it's, wow. The stuff that happens towards the end of this book It's a book that ramps up. You know, at first we have to get to know the characters, we have to get to know the world. It's not super complicated world, um, but there are creatures we haven't seen before. There are peoples and lands we haven't seen before, and Mr. Moore does a good job of telling us about them. It doesn't get bogged down. The pace is good. The story starts off pretty straightforward, then kind of splits off, and we have a couple different groups doing different things. But of course, it all ties together, and it builds and builds and builds, and then at the end, there's just so much going on. And see, I don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, bad stuff happens, and I want to know what's going to happen next. There are authors that can cross genres, and I think there are authors that can't. Apparently, James A. Moore is one of those that can, because this is a fantastic book. Um, I really love his horror. Uh, I just happen to be reading another of his books right now that I think is fantastic. It's called Smile No More, and I'll probably be doing a review of that when I'm finished with it, because it's just great. Um, I'm not a huge fantasy fan. I used to be when I was younger, but I've kind of gotten away from it. I do like to go back every once in a while and check out some new things, and I've read some really good stuff recently by some different authors. Uh, but still, a little nervous about seeing what Mr. Moore would do in a fantasy world, and I shouldn't have been. It's a great book. Um, I haven't been too disappointed with anything I've read from Angry Robot. There's their logo all blurry for you. Um, I have a lot of Angry Robot books. They have a lot of great authors. Um, a lot of authors I hadn't read until they had something from Angry Robot, and that caught my eye. Um, this is actually one of the few, I think, Angry Robot authors that I've got tons of his stuff before this ever came out, before he started working for them. I've seen the cover of the next book. It looks fantastic. This is going to be blurry. I don't know if you can see the silver hand there. That's part of the story. You got to learn about that, and these people always keep their faces cut, the lower part of their faces covered. We don't know why yet. Don't know what's going on with them, but yeah, something's going on. I'll tell you that. So the characters are great. There's a lot of you get a lot of background on the characters. I think you're going to come to like the characters, and you're going to want to know what happens to them. And you're going to be glad when something good happens. You're going to be upset when something bad happens. And bad stuff happens. It's a book. Without conflict, what are you going to have? Um, it's not Lord of the Rings. It's not that kind of fantasy. There's some different types of fantasy. I think Lord of the Rings is the one type with the I don't know how to put it, the questing fantasy, the really deep fantasy, and then you've got maybe at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the sort of sword and sorcery Conan type fantasy with a lot of just muscular barbarians chopping things with swords. I don't know. This kind of falls in the middle, I suppose, although I think it may lean a little towards Conan, not so much Lord of the Rings. Um, but there's room for all sorts of types of fantasy. Um, and this fits in nicely. And that's Seven Forges by James A. Moore. Again, I picked this up at Barnes & Noble. It's available on the internet. Should be pretty easy to find. I don't know if you can order directly from Angry Robot, but you could give it a try if you are so inclined. So Seven Forges, James A. Moore. Pick it up. Enjoy it. If you have any comments, questions, or corrections, as always, put them in the comments below, because I'm always happy to hear from people and read more books.